So the moment that food became like magic to me, probably it was 7, 8, and we went to visit during Lent, old uncle of mine, first time ever, in a tiny town called Rivas, in the region of Aragon. And when we arrived there, it was kind of cold, slightly rainy. The house was dark with very big walls, old house, probably from 18th, 19th century. And he only had a very big iron pot on the fire and a wooden table filled up with breadcrumbs that he was cutting there with a very old knife. I was very hungry and I was like, bread? That's what we have for dinner? Well, he began cooking that bread with some pork fat. And probably that ritual of roasting the bread in the big iron pot lasted, I don't know, over an hour. At the very end, something magic happened to that bread with the pork fat. We call that dish migas in Spain. But I never eaten something so humble, but so amazingly delicious. That humble breadcrumbs in a plate, in a dark room, with the fire creating shadows all around me. Almost shadows that were telling me, what are you doing? Why are you eating this? In that moment when I put that spoon of those warm, crispy, but soft at the same time in a very strange way, breadcrumbs in my mouth, that moment, probably that moment alone, I knew that I wanted to be part of whatever cooking meant. That's when I saw for first time magic in cooking, magic in a pot.
I like to make things up in the kitchen rather than repeat what someone else has done. It's more interesting, and sometimes, often, it produces a really interesting result. Something that people say that they like, and that, I don't know, functions more in the way that we imagine things instead of like reading an instruction manual. So I have to admit that it absolutely terrifies people who watch it, the process, even though it turns out usually very well. And there are occasions when the result is inedible. But that's the price that really interesting new ideas comes with.
So there was definitely a time in my life when I was younger where food made sense, much more in a sustenance or just for energy, a sustenance of life that really leapt out to me. We had big family reunions in central Pennsylvania. Everybody would get together, 80 to 100 people, lots of eating, lots of feasting, and the opportunity was more about us getting together and having a great time with family. But when I was 7 years old, I had a great uncle who would drive to the Jersey Shore, and he would always bring back scallops and clams, and he had a big old-fashioned clam steamer. And I remember the first time that I ate a steamed clam followed by the juice that gathered at the bottom of the pan. And it was for the first time that I realized that there was just tremendous amounts of pleasure in the act of eating. For me, growing up in a farm community, surrounded by food that was very simple and basic, that there could be something so exotic and from the ocean that could transform and create the sensations that I was feeling, and it stayed with me ever since. I think often back to that old-fashioned clam steamer with the spigot at the bottom where you could fill up your clam juice and all the melted butter at the end. And when I eat clams, I always think back to those times.
I love cooking. I love cooking and making people happy. And something about food can transform you to another place. When I'm cooking one of my favorite dishes sometimes, like spaghetti alla carbonara, reminds me of when I lived in Rome. So I'm actually feeding myself, but my soul feels good as well. Reminds me of being back in Italy.
I don't think that there was ever a specific moment in which I realized that food was more than nourishment. And I believe that it's because it just always naturally was. I was born that way. Unfortunately or fortunately, Mom says that even at 2 years old, I would devour not just my food, but everybody else's food that I could get my little tiny hands on. And what food is to me, though, is very sweet memories. Like there's people that smell a perfume or hear a song and it takes them to a specific person and a place in time. For me, food is that. And if I smell fricassé or arroz con pollo, chicken and rice, that takes me to two different grandmothers. And it's almost as if I would be smelling them as humans next to me. So it connects me to those incredible memories of childhood. Coffee does that to me. It reminds me of my grandfather. So I believe that, and it's also always been a way for me to express love. If I want to conquer someone, if I want to make someone feel good, then I cook for them. And so it is always not just a memory of, but it's an act of love. That's the best way for me to describe it.
Food. So important, right? To nourish you. What else can food do? I think it can change people. I think it can make people happy. One of my fondest memories is when I was 10 years old in Dayton, Ohio. Back then we never locked the doors. Ding dong. My uncle's driving through, and everyone was an uncle auntie. My parents were not home. They were driving through Dayton, Ohio. In the Chinese culture, you actually say "churlama," which is "have you eaten," not "how are you." And they're like, "Oh, we're starved." I'm like, "Okay, please sit down. Let me make you some fried rice." I'm 10. And that's all fine and dandy because I've seen fried rice made 1,000 times by grandparents and parents, but I'd never made it myself. So kind of ballsy, honestly, but I knew how to use a knife. I sharpened cleavers with my grandfather, yeah. So I got the ginger and the garlic chopped. I got the scallions chopped. I did the scrambled eggs well, nice and puffy. Then I made the fried rice. Honestly, it's about a 5 or 6 out of 10 in quality. I kind of chickened down on the oil, a little too much so it wouldn't stick, a little too heavy-handed on the soy sauce. But you know what? It didn't matter. They took a bite. They were amazed, I think, that a 10-year-old can make fried rice. But more importantly, they smiled. It made them happy. I'm like, oh my God, food can make you happy? This could be a cool career. I was 10, I have not stopped cooking since then. And a huge salute to Ferran Adria, truly one of the masters that we have in this world. He made for my wife and I a 37-course, 5.5-hour meal his last year in La Rosas at El Bulli. I don't think anyone is ever going to be able to touch that. Truly a master at that.
I started cooking when I was a little kid. I was a 5-year-old with my grandmother, and I remember she made this sweet, delicious fudge. She was from Yorkshire, the north of England. And they do this thing, I mean, for a kid, it's like crack. It's just so sweet and so delicious and creamy and fantastic. And I can remember eating it and wanting to learn how it was made so I could make it whenever I wanted. And I did that with her, and I said, that's it. You know, my whole life's going to revolve around food. And it's what made me become a chef. I started working in a hotel in Melbourne, and when I got my hands on a book called White Heat from Marco Pierre White, I read about this intensity. I read about this guy who just worked and worked and worked, and I thought, what can it be that transports someone from a normal life to one that only cares about food? What's so interesting? So I decided at the age of 20 that I was moving to Europe to go and find out, and I went on this journey. I now have lived in a bunch of different countries. I've worked for chefs all over the world. I spent 8 years with Marco. Food has the power to change your life, and it's certainly changed mine. And it's just the most unbelievable thing. For me, it really started with the written word. You know, I'm sitting in front of a bunch of books. I love to read and I love to learn about the passion other chefs have for food, and then take some of that passion and think about ingredients in a different way. Food is the most beautiful thing that God's ever given me. And if you go on the journey, I'm sure it's going to be the same for you.
This is the moment that food became something more than just substance and something transcendent to me. was in this small village in Tuscany in market, and I was hungry, and all I wanted was this one very beautiful looking apple. And I turned into the ugly American. I picked the apple up that I wanted, and I said, I want this one. And you don't do that. You let the person selling it say, pick it out for you. But I did it anyway. And so the terse exchange of me being poorly behaved happened, and I took my apple and I started wandering around in the square, and I bit into this apple, and at that very moment, like, every bit of what that apple was came flooding into my senses. It was the soil. It was the weeds around the tree. It was the generations of families who have grown apples in that same place for probably a couple of centuries, and all of this. I felt like I'd just been punched and almost fell down from this, but that very experience of the consciousness of what it took to create that apple was a moment that just will stay with me forever. When something so humble became something so much greater than the sum of its parts, and from that moment on, the idea of just simplicity and the appreciation of what it takes to produce something that we take for granted in a lot of ways has always been at the forefront of my mind. Really changed the way that I approach food and my cooking style forever.
A real turning point for me was a charity dinner I cooked in Jerusalem along with many other chefs from different countries, including Israel and Palestine. There were religious leaders and politicians and all kinds of dignitaries from all over the world. And what was so special about that night was that all focus was on the food. There was no talk of religion or politics, and food transcended all the barriers and the borders that we as humans sometimes build for ourselves. It was really an extraordinary thing, and it inspired my book, The Shared Table. Here in New York, after the attacks on 9/11, I started Operation Chefs with Spirit, and we fed over 1 million meals to the relief workers after the tragedy. And I saw firsthand the extraordinary power of food to heal. It was the most magnificent thing I've ever seen in my life. And it was the food that was not only the nourishment for the body, but more importantly, it was nourishment for the soul. I'd like to thank the Dali Museum for allowing me to express my thoughts on food, and for the honor bestowed upon one of the most passionate and brilliant chefs in the world, Ferran Adria.
When I was about 6 years old, and it was past my bedtime, and my mother was having a beautiful dinner for her family and friends, and I remember hiding behind the stairs and seeing everything that happened around the table. It was a beautiful table with different foods from my country, Venezuela, and everything that happened there, how they exchanged ideas, laughed. I knew that a lot of things that are good, and the connection that you can have with another human being, it can have another different meaning when you do it around the table.
All right, so one of my first big culinary inspirational moments is when, about 30 years ago, the chef Norman Van Aken from Miami came into my restaurant, and he was doing a local media thing. And so I come from a background of traditional classical style cooking, and he was doing all this fusion cooking with tropical fruits. He was doing this cool thing with the black pepper rum paint, and it really opened my eyes to a new kind of cooking that I was never exposed to. And I found that so important to me because it really sparked a culinary interest for me that I didn't know I had. And from then on, I kept exploring very exciting global style cooking, and to this day now, I still practice that in my kitchen, and I try to inspire that in my cooks. So thank you, Norman Van Aken, for opening my eyes to that, and enjoy.
Food always been a passion of mine since I grew up in Burgundy, where with my parents and my grandparents, my mom and my grandma always cooking at home. My grandparents grow their own vegetables. That was a way of living. I recall many nights peeling or cleaning vegetables, haricot verts, salsifis, with families and friends, and having almost like an event about it. Everybody get-togethers or cooking bits and peeling them, and my grandma would sell them in the market. It always been something we grew up with. I always remember my mom and my grandma doing the same dish with the same ingredients. Somehow they will both taste different, both good but both different. So that's what I decided. It was something I was intrigued by, something I really want to do. I always wanted to be a chef since I was 2-3-year-old, and I remember making cakes. It was called a yogurt cake, and I still know the recipe right now. I remember it was 1 cup of yogurt, then you mix with 2 cups of sugar and 3 cups of flour, and the cups was actually the yogurt container. As a kid, it was easy to make. Couple eggs, mix it up, and then just bake it. It was a very plain cake. It was like a pound cake, but so much fun as a kid to see the evolution of all those simple ingredients get together and form something you can eat. That's where I get my passion from food.
I grew up in a Middle Eastern household, and so my mother and father, my mother had 11 brothers and sisters, and 9 of which immigrated to the United States, all within about a 1-year time period. And I was probably 5 years old at the time. And my mom was entertaining all of her brothers and sisters and all her family. And it was going to be 25 to 35 people coming to our home, plus another 20 kids. And I've never seen so much stress to this day in my mother and in my father, because the emotion of having all of their family coming, family members that they hadn't seen since they had immigrated from Egypt. And that emotion, coupled with the reality that you had to cook for everybody and you had to entertain everybody, and there was going to be everything from arguing to laughing to loving to any emotion that you could possibly feel. And I'll never forget, as people were coming into the house and my aunts and uncles were coming in, and everybody got there and everybody got to the table, and my mom said to me, Michael, would you please come and help me bring the bread? And she had made this loaf of bread, and the bread was in the oven, and you open the oven door and the whole house smelled like this bread. We brought the bread to the table, and in typical Middle Eastern fashion, what happens in a meal is much more than a meal. A meal in the Middle East is an experience. You're at this table sometimes for 3 to 4 to 5 hours, and the food, keeps coming, and you start with the bread, and you start with many different dishes on the table, and you have conversation, and you laugh, and you share thoughts, and you share memories together, and then you cry, because we're very emotional people. But the thing that always stops the conversation is when the food comes. And my mom made a dish. It was the first time I had ever had kushari. And to me, it was the dish that really symbolized to me just the warmth of everything coming together. It was rice and chickpeas and lentils with caramelized onions and a spicy tomato sauce. And you just ate the kushari, and I couldn't stop eating it. And I watched everybody, when I got to the table, dive in and start eating this. And at that moment, everybody had relaxed. The whole room had changed. The whole ambiance of that day had changed and had shifted. And I really looked around, and at that moment, I really realized that food has so much more power than just nutrients. Food is the way that people really do connect.
So from my early childhood, my aunt used to make latkes. These were cornmeal latkes, not potato latkes, which is a completely different tradition. Actually, my wife has the German potato latke tradition. But the cornmeal latkes came from a very Jewish tradition. My mother didn't cook at all. She was a professional lady. My aunt was professional too, but somehow she had this from her grandmother. And these latkes, I remember very clearly, frying in the pan. She would use a whole stick of butter, which is hard to imagine now, and they would sort of float in the butter. but they weren't greasy when they came out, and we always had them with sweet maple syrup. A lot of sweetness there. She died a few years ago, and I haven't had latke since. But I tried to learn from her how to make them, and they really are something that span the path from her to me, and which I would like to continue and keep in that living way. The taste of the food and the smell of the food moves over time.
My father's mother, my abuela, was widowed early in life and was on a fixed income. And I was mystified at her approach and how different it was from my other grandmothers to cooking. My abuela would spend all day making picadillo or double crab filling, only to wake up the next morning where she would then make the dough. And I'd watch her roll croqueta after croqueta, fill empanada after empanada. She would make hundreds of these for our family. The painstaking, laborious effort that I would watch her put into that was mystifying to me. When I would go to my mom's house, my ma was wealthy. She never learned to drive. She had a driver all her life. When she wanted ground beef, she'd go to the meat market and buy an entire tenderloin of beef to have it ground just for her ground beef. So their approaches were very different. My favorite times, though, were on Sundays, where we would all gather at Ma's house, and she had this stunning Florida room that had this long glass table, maybe 20 feet long, and the sun would shine in on it. And being the littlest one in the family, I would immediately run into that room and I'd run into the table because I knew what was about to begin. I wanted to watch the procession of dishes that would fill this table. And my anticipation, because I knew what was about to happen. I knew that the entire family, no matter how loud they had gotten, no matter how grumpy they were all going to get around that table and we were going to all start eating together. And as we did that, everybody was at peace. Everybody was in love with each other, passing food around and this experience of eating this food. I remember the deliciousness. I remember the layers of flavor in their cooking, the textures, the depth of flavor. It's my first flavor memories that I've never forgot. And when I think about how this grumpy, loud family, and I'm being nice, would sit around this table and have these moments, those are the moments that I lived for. They were my most favorite moments. And to think that food and cooking was this connective tissue. I knew then that food and cooking was love. And I knew that I had to be a part of it. I wanted to make people feel the way my grandmothers always made us feel. I knew that food and cooking was going to be my life.
Mi primer recuerdo del sabor es también mi primer recuerdo del olor. El sabor y el olor de un caldo de verduras hirviendo a fuego lento en la cocina de leña de la casa de campo que tenía mi abuelo junto al arroyo Carmelo en el sur de Uruguay. Una sopa paisana intensa y deliciosa en la que se mezclaban el aroma de la leña y el sabor de 1000 verduras perfumando la casa. Este sabor que impregnó mi infancia y lo busco sin parar otra vez.
I remember going to a very fancy restaurant that I read about. It was, I believe at the time, a 3-star Michelin. I didn't really know Michelin, I didn't know about French cooking whatsoever. But I remember putting a suit on and going in there on a Friday and realizing for the first time at that moment, food was more than just something you eat. I remember very specifically seeing the madame or the front of the house person, or as it turns out, the wife of the chef in a beautiful white outfit. And then I recall also seeing the husband, the chef, come out of the kitchen and greet his wife and say hello and walk around the dining room and saying hello to all the guests before a parade of food started coming out. And guests were oohing and eyeing, and I myself participated in something that was more than just food. It was like Broadway. It was a play. It was a magnificent, something I had never seen before. At that moment, I had decided that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. Entertain, make people happy. I wanted Broadway, 3 shows a day, that magnificent set that I saw when I was 21 in Paris. That's where it all began.
As a child growing up, my mother and my grandmother were both very good cooks, incredible cooks, authentic cooks, which led me as a child to cook. And I cooked childish things. As I got older, I had another career that was going very well. But every Friday night, I had an open house and I would cook a lot of food. I would go to the market and buy whatever just appeared to be good and go home and figured something out to do with it. And I shared this food with people. And seeing the expression on people when they were really loving the food brought me a lot of happiness, brought me a lot of warmth. And that's when I decided that I needed to do something more than the other career that I had. And I continued to cook. And I started cooking in my home. And now, again, I live in the mountains. And fortunately for me, I'm cooking in my home again. And people are coming to me from all over the world, which gives me a great pleasure. The authenticity of cooking from your soul, that's what it's all about.
I was born in Mexico because my mom is Mexican, but I've always lived in Barcelona with both my parents and my brother. When I was a kid, we used to go to Mexico, spend summers, and one of the things I loved the most was to arrive and have a cup of the soup my grandma prepared specially for us and for me, which was a noodle soup with coriander, spicy, a bit hot, very delicious. One of those summers, I must have been 5, 6, 7 years old. I remember when we left, it was always a very sad moment. Everybody was crying, my mom especially. And but then we arrived to Barcelona, and a few days after we were back, it came into my mind, or I asked myself, what was I missing most? My grandmother or her soup? And in that moment, I became conscious, probably for the first time, about food's transcendental dimension in a very strange way, because I felt guilty also, basically, about the fact that probably I was missing more my grandma's soup than my grandma.
If there is any limit to any type of food, the one you want to prepare, and or any ingredient, and honestly, I don't think there is any limit, because even when you think you get you get to the limit, you say, let's say this is the most I can do with that. The day after, you're gonna try to find out, if there is one more step at the one you can go. And that is the beauty of food, and is the beauty of cooking, and that is why food is passion, is love, but is absolutely art of flavor and art of presentation, and is just an art to how to combine all these ingredients together to just let see people when they eat it, with a cute smile in their face, they say, wow, I never tried something like that. And that for me is what there is the future of food.
Food for me started at a very young age. I got lucky enough when I was around 10 or 11 to go fishing in Puget Sound, Seattle. We were also lucky enough to reel in 2 king salmon that day. But more than the actual fishing trip with my father, my uncle, and my brother, I remember mostly about coming home, and we packed them on ice, flew them home, and we got to put them on the grill. Watching a whole fish being cooked on the grill was more memorable to me than actually catching the fish. As I look back now, I still remember how that fish tastes coming off the grill. The smokiness, the richness of wild salmon was something that I had never even thought of having before, but it really kind of transpired how I looked at food as a whole. Later on, in another summer, we stopped at a local fish market between here and Crystal River, and we picked up a whole grouper and brought that home, prepped it up. I was a little bit older now, so I could actually get in the kitchen help and cooked a whole grouper head on. I mean, just the first time to actually taste parts of the fish that I had never tasted, you know, behind the jaws, the meat that actually you don't always get to eat. Really just kind of opened my eyes to how cooking was. So at a young age, you always look forward to being able to cook with my dad, cook with my mother in the kitchen, actually do some things that not any other kid I probably at that age was even thinking about. So that's when food changed for me.
So what inspires me most about food is the memories associated with a good meal. For example, I just came back from France, and what I remember most about the trip is a poached pear that I had. When it came to the table, it was just mind-blowing. It was just a poached pear that had all the right garnishes, and it just blew me away. The only thing I could keep thinking about was this pear, and how such a one ingredient just turned out so amazing that it just consumed my thoughts for the rest of the trip. And even when I came back, I just kept thinking about this pear. Like, maybe you would think, oh, the Eiffel Tower. No, it was just pear that just consumed my thoughts. So I recently had a party for 100 people, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to poach 100 pears. I'm going to core out the seeds, and then I'm going to stuff the core with a chocolate truffle. So when the customers cut into the pear, they would see this beautiful chocolate truffle just that fits perfectly inside the pear. It's like a perfect fit. So I was peeking into the dining room, and I could just see the smiles and the oohs and the ahs that they were just so excited about this pear. And that's the memory I had, and now I see that it passed on to them. So that's what inspires me.